in secular and religious fundamentalism in the human rights discourse. This event is part of our ongoing series in which we examine the issue of religion, secularism, and human rights. The reason that we chose this topic for the current academic year is because of the problematic relation between religious and human rights. Their interplay constitutes a rather complex and contested issue area. Some have argued that religion has always posed a challenge to claims that human rights constitute a universal discourse of human emancipations. Other analysts have argued that the human rights discourse is reflective of what they have termed a form of secular fundamentalism, and as a result, it has sought to marginalize religious-based alternative discourses seeking justice and inclusive social orders. To explore this relationship, we are very pleased to have with us today a distinguished group of panelists: Abdullahiya Naeem, Janet A. Buckingham, Richard Falk, and Stephen Cattell. The panel will be moderated by our colleague Avi Bernstein from the Anthropology Department here at John Jay. I would like to take this opportunity again to thank all of you for being with us today and acknowledge our co-sponsors for this event, which are the Master Program in International Crime and Justice, the Department of Political Science, the Master Program in Human Rights, as well as the Minor in Human Rights Studies. Without further ado, I'll give the floor now to my colleague Avi, who will chair the panel and also moderate the discussion that will follow. Avi?
Good evening to everybody. Welcome to our panel here at John Jay. Thank you very much, George, Professor Andreopoulos, for all the tremendous work you have brought to John Jay over the couple of decades that you've been with us. You outdo yourself each time, and this panel is a great example of that. Let us begin with Professor Richard Falk, who is the Professor of International Law Emeritus at Princeton University and the Chair of Global Law Faculty and on the Law Faculty at Queen Mary University, London. His most recent books are Power Shift and Public Intellectual, The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim. I introduce to you Professor Richard Falk.
Richard.
Professor Falk, please let me try to unmute you if I can. Let's see. Maybe you can unmute yourself. We're not hearing you yet.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you very much for a gracious introduction. And I'm very glad to be part of this panel on this really central issue of late modernity, how to combine our understandings of religion and a secular worldview that is embodied in the whole modern notion of progress and of how to best organize individual and social life on the basis of reason. I think it has to be understood that secularism reacted to religion in a way that was the reaction expressed the sense that human progress depended, especially in the European context, on the limiting of the religious sphere in ways that didn't interfere with economic and political governance. And it was this effort at liberating society from the perceived inhibitions of religion that produced the new configuration of Western civilization by reference to secularism. But secularism as a reaction also had the difficulties or complexities of responding in different ways in different settings. And my own experience of 3 countries illustrates, I think, why this is an interesting subject to explore. And the countries are Turkey, Iran, and the United States. And I should say, as a preliminary to that, that the human rights discourse, I think, emerges out of Western secularism. And in that sense, is initially, at any rate, a contribution of secularism to what we understand to be civilization in its positive forms. My experience over the last 25 or so years in Turkey illustrated a society that strongly embraced secularism after its Republican revolution in the aftermath of World War I and the emergence of Kemal Ataturk as a leader. And he definitely and explicitly saw Islam as it functioned in Turkey as an obstacle to creating the sort of modern state that he envisioned France, for instance, to be and wanted Turkey to be. And that kind of secularism in a society that was existentially still religious, in other words, the great majority of Turks believed in the practice and observance of Islam and were therefore not really persuaded by the secular ideology, although they greatly admired the constitutional system that Ataturk had introduced into Turkey and the defeat of colonial ambitions in Turkey after World War I. But what I experienced was the excesses of secularism on the part of elites that had emerged in the Kemalist tradition. And it was then that the terminology of secular fundamentalism occurred to me because I saw women, for instance, being denied the right to wear headscarves in places, institutions of higher learning, or in certain venues of employment like government. And that seemed to be an interference with human rights as understood as including freedom of religion. And so I thought of this kind of imposition as a excess of the kind of tolerance that is embedded in the human rights discourse and is part of what I think recognizes the diversity of human belief. And this suspicion of mine that imposing modernity on a existentially religious society is bound to lead to a collision of fundamentalisms. And that's what I think has occurred subsequently when, through a democratic process, a religiously oriented leadership was elected in Turkey in 2002 and has existed ever since. In contrast was my experience of Iran, in which a secular dynasty under the leadership of the Shah was overthrown by a mass revolutionary movement that was religiously oriented and led and produced a religious state that was intolerant of non-Islamic belief systems and of deviation from rather strictly interpreted religious practices. And this experience in Iran suggested expressed a kind of virulent form of fundamentalism, especially as expressed toward non-Islamic religious minority, and in particular, the Baha'is, who worshipped a prophet after Muhammad and were viewed from the Orthodox Islamic or Shia perspective as heretical. In turn, my own experience of the United States as secularism was really one which made a strong effort at reconciling human rights and secularism with religious tolerance and freedom of religion. And it did this through the formula of separating church and state and allowing each to pluralism to exist both politically and religiously. But it was tested and had been tested in various ways by political events, most recently the 9/11 attacks, which were attributed to Islamist elements and produced a kind of Islamophobia within the country that suggested a form of negative fundamentalism, not that the particular belief system was deserved to be treated as the truth, but as a belief system that was dangerous and needed to be suppressed. And so you have these various manifestations of fundamentalism that can occur even within the framework of this separation that had worked in many ways very well as a way of combining religious and political tolerance. And my own sense is that the future is one where we have to make contextual judgments as to the interplay between secularism and religious belief and practice, and that requires a sensitivity to what constitutes the limits of tolerance within a national and civilizational structure. Let me stop there and not exceed my time limit.
Thank you very much, Professor Falk. We will continue with our next speaker, and at the end we will have questions and discussion. So let me continue and introduce Professor Janet Buckingham, who lives in Ottawa and has served as the director of the Global Advocacy for the World Evangelical Alliance since July 2021. She is a professor of political studies at Trinity Western University with a research focus on religious freedom law in Canada and internationally. She is also the co-director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom in Vancouver. Professor Buckingham is the executive editor of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in such an interesting and invigorating panel discussion. The term fundamentalist was originally adopted by American Christians a century ago. They were self-identifying as standing for the fundamentals of Christianity as against liberal theology and anti-religious tendencies of the focus on the scientific method as part of modernity. They stood against the then current approach to biblical interpretation that relativized the Bible. They also stood against Darwinian evolution being taught in schools, and this was typified by the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. The term fundamentalist was given new life when the moral majority expanded in the 1970s and 80s. The term fundamentalist was expanded after the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 to include non-Christian religions. Iran had been moderate, modern, and Muslim prior to the revolution. The revolution replaced a pro-Western absolute monarchy with an anti-Western theocracy. Between the 1920s and the 1970s, various other religious movements that married very conservative interpretations of religious beliefs and practices with nationalism also developed. This includes the Muslim Brotherhood, which originated in the 1930s, the Hindu nationalist RSS in India. Apologies, I'm not going to try and pronounce the actual name of the RSS. In the 1940s, Sinhala Buddhism developed as a national movement in Sri Lanka. Finally, Wahhabism, which had been the dominant faith in Saudi Arabia, gained new vigor in the 1970s. Some of these fundamentalist religious movements have a large amount of control of governments in India, Sri Lanka, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan. All these fundamentalist movements have some shared characteristics, and at this point, I am going to try and share my PowerPoint screen, just because I think when you're doing lists of things, it's always helpful to be able to see the list. There it is. So here are 4 characteristics that I've identified of fundamentalist religious movements. First, they adopt a rigid interpretation of their religious beliefs, which tends to be anti-modern and in many parts of the world also anti-Western. Second, they are strongly committed to their interpretation and tend to view it as the truth. They are therefore intolerant of other beliefs. 3, they tend to blend religious beliefs with ethnic and religious identity. I note that fundamentalist religion is usually the majority religion in a region or nation. Fourth, they're willing to use the machinery of the state to give priority to their religion and marginalize other religions within the boundaries of the state. I note at this point that not all religions or religious expression is fundamentalist, far from it. Many religious adherents live as minorities and many under various forms of marginalization or repression in all parts of the world. But with this in mind, I would like to look at secularism to see under what circumstances it can become fundamentalist. So I'm going to look at these same 4 characteristics and apply them to secularism. So first, secular beliefs are modern and were developed in the West. So secularists cannot, by definition, adopt rigid beliefs that are anti-modern and anti-Western. But secularist beliefs can become rigidly defined. For example, in Canada, several political parties require candidates running for political office to commit to being pro-choice. A woman's right to choose an abortion is therefore considered a fundamental tenet of secular progressive beliefs. 2, secularists tend to be anti-religious. This seems contrary to their stated belief that tolerance is the highest virtue. However, the argument is made that one should not tolerate those who are intolerant, such as religious fundamentalists. I note again the exclusion of pro-life candidates for certain political parties in Canada. Another argument that I've heard and seen is that religion is a private matter and should be excluded from public life. In Mexico, for example, which has a secular government, this has resulted in Christians not being free to talk about their faith at work, or they may be ridiculed or excluded from being promoted. Children are bullied at school if they talk about their faith. 3, as secularism gains momentum in a country, France, for example, secularity can become part of national identity. While Roman Catholicism and no religion are both 40% on the French census, few French people actually practice Roman Catholicism. A 2021 update on the laïcité law in France seeks to protect laïcité. Now, one would not think that the majority would be in need of protection against the minority, but this law is not really about protecting non-practicing Catholics from practicing Catholics. It is really about protecting the majority from the perceived threat from practicing religious groups, and in this case, particularly the minority Muslim population. 4th, France is therefore a good example of using government regulation to protect secularism from religious adherence. We've also had a recent law in the Canadian province of Quebec prohibiting government employees who serve the public from wearing religious symbols. Apparently, it is harmful to children to see teachers wearing a hijab. I hope I have convinced you that secularism can become fundamentalist. That is not to say that every secular government is fundamentalists and adopts policies that exclude religious minorities. But in the same way that religions can develop fundamentalist tendencies under certain circumstances, secularism can as well. There has been a great deal of debate in academic circles about the nature of secular governments. Charles Taylor, for example, refers to open secularism versus closed secularism. Open secularism is open to and encouraging of a plurality of religious beliefs and of no religion. Closed secularism, on the other hand, excludes religion from the public square and reduces it to freedom to worship and may even put restrictions on that. It is closed secularism that has tendencies towards becoming fundamentalist. Another concept that is popular in academic circles and in the discourse and even in court decisions is that secular governments should be neutral towards religion. The implication is that all religions should be treated similarly. I mentioned the new law in Quebec, Canada, that prohibits certain government employees from wearing religious symbols. In its original proposal, Roman Catholic religious symbols were permitted on the basis that they were an historic part of Quebec culture. There's always a tendency to favor that which is familiar and historical in a particular culture. In the end, that exclusion was removed so that all religion is equally marginalized in Quebec. However, true neutrality would treat non-religion the same as religion. Fundamentalist secularism gives priority to non-religion over religion. Well, up to this point, I've refrained from naming the country that is the most obvious example of fundamentalist secularism, and that would be China. As Feng Gangyang has stated, the Chinese Communist Party's official position is atheist. However, that has not always been equally applied, or even applied at all. Buddhism and Taoism are treated relatively favorably. Islam and Christianity are subject to more state control and sometimes repressed. The current treatment of Uyghur Muslims is a good example of repression. I know China here as a segue to discussing how the international human rights system can address fundamentalist secularism. While China's constitution guarantees freedom of religion, it is subject to the Chinese Communist Party's policies, which are officially atheist. And what has the international human rights system done about this? Has China been sanctioned? Has it even been criticized by the international community for its treatment of religious minorities? The reality is that the international human rights system has done very little about Chinese repression of religion and religious minorities. True, some governments have raised the issue in bilateral meetings. NGOs routinely name and shame China at the UN Human Rights Council, but the reality is that, as we have seen during COVID, the world is dependent on China economically, and no one wants to provoke it. I appreciate very much the work of the United Nations. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights is the foundation for international human rights protection. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its mechanisms are valuable for raising issues of rights violations. The Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief is very helpful in investigating and reporting on systemic violations of religious freedom. However, if a country does not accept his request to visit, he has no ability to investigate allegations. The Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Committee also have powers to hold hearings and make reports about violations of religious freedom, along with other human rights. The Universal Periodic Review Mechanism is valuable to raise issues of rights violations. No country is exempt from UPR. But each of these has its own limitations. As we know, the Council routinely has members that are known violators of human rights, and the committee only investigates complaints. I also note in the international human rights system, the important regional human rights mechanisms in Europe, the Inter-American system, and the system in Africa. While mechanisms exist and are being used, I do not see change happening. And indeed, where secularism has reached the level of fundamentalist secularism, it is unlikely that change will happen. But where it is in process, and we see countries where secularism is moving to restrict religion, there is an opportunity. Those are the countries where international mechanisms might be effective to effect change to more open secularism that welcomes religion rather than repressing it.
Thank you so much, Professor Buckingham. Before we move on, let me just make a note that if any of you have questions, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be introducing questions after the panelists all present. I'll try to take them in order after we have some discussion with the panelists. So our next panelist is Professor Abdullahi Ahmed Naeem. He is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Law at Emory Law School. He is an Associated Professor in the Emory College of Arts and Sciences and Senior Fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion of Emory University. His most recent book is Decolonizing Human Rights from Cambridge. Thank you very much. Welcome, Professor Naim.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to rejoin with old friends and to make new ones. So I will miss this because I'm retiring soon, and it will be a struggle to be part of these vigorous communities. But I also want to preface by saying that I tend to get a little bit carried away, you might say. I come from Sudan. I am Sudanese. I am a practicing Muslim, but I am an advocate of human rights on my terms since the 1980s, or since even law school student, as a student. So I make no apology, but I am, just briefly to put things in perspective, initially in the 80s and earlier and into the 90s, I was critical of Sharia from a human rights perspective. That is, the obvious problems of women's rights, equality, non-Muslims, freedom of religion and apostasy and so on. But since the 90s, I have come also to be critical of the human rights side of the equation, that we tend to take human rights too much for granted and assume that they are what the Universal Declaration and the process and treaties since then have made them to be. Whereas in my view, and this is the subject of this recent book, Decolonizing Human Rights, I believe that in fact, the international human rights paradigm has been extremely ineffective and in fact counterproductive, because it has promoted an elitism among the major former colonial powers, which are now neo-colonial powers, in manipulating the human rights paradigm to promote their own foreign policy objectives. And I can go into examples of that, or recent examples, of course, but for now, I will just leave it at that, simply, let me just put it this way, that to protect human rights means to preempt their violation. Whereas the nature of the legal protection is to be subsequent to and to try to react to violations which already occurred. There is no possibility of legal protection until a wrong has been committed. And that is not protection. And second, that the nature of the international diplomacy and power relations is such that many states get away with much more egregious violations and fundamental violations, and are not yet criticized for them. And I think the United States is a prime example of that. I think the United States has one of the weakest and the poorest records of human rights protection anywhere in the world. And again, I'm happy to elaborate if people choose to do that. But let me go to begin with the, so this is part of what I call revisiting the human rights paradigm. In 1945-48, when the Universal Declaration was being drafted, there were only 4 members of the United Nations from the entire continent of Africa. And there were only 8 members from the entire continent of Asia. I would say that just by guessing in terms of the regions, I think probably the majority of humanity was excluded from the process of interpreting, understanding, and implementing human rights protection. And that the irony is that African and Muslim majority countries, by the way, all of them, including places like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and Iran, really that they were really very ineffective, or they had little access to the possibility of articulating their view of human rights. And that, of course, it reflects on the irony, as I said, is that those African states, and now there are 54 members, states of Africa, which are members of the African Union. So it's a huge number. 50 who are now states were not allowed to be part of the UN at all because they lacked sovereignty. Why did they lack sovereignty? Because the same major powers who are the current membership of the Security Council are the ones who denied their sovereignty by seizing it by military conquest. And that, therefore, the irony is to say, well, you can't be part of this privileged elite because you don't have sovereignty. Where did our sovereignty go? We took it away. Can we have it back? Not really, until we decide that you deserve it. And the example of France that was mentioned earlier, France continued to wage a vicious anti-colonial war in Algeria until the early 1960s. Although the Universal Declaration was received and proclaimed in Paris, France. So it is really, I mean, there is a very, very messy history and it's still current, because very much, I think the way that we look at, you know, sometimes I try to think, trying to anticipate what other people might object to my argument, try to think, what do we mean by protection of human rights? Where has it ever happened? By whom and to what end? And I see that actually, I will, in my view, none, no protection whatsoever. Again, I will have to go on because of the time limitation, but happy to revisit. Now, religious fundamentalism was mentioned earlier as primarily an American phenomena of Christianity and so on. I think if we take the objective definition of what fundamentalism is about, what it seeks to achieve, it has always been with us. I don't think that in human history, we have a religious tradition or a community that was free from fundamentalism, whether secular or religious. In the Muslim context, for example, which is often currently overlooked, in the earliest part of the Muslim history, there was a group called Al-Khawarij, which literally means the renegades, those who exited from the tradition, who opposed the tradition. Al-Khawarij were fundamentalists, and they were fundamentalists more than any of the fundamentalists that we know today. The point for me is that if we acknowledge that, we understand Muslim apologetics for fundamentalism is wrong, but non-Muslim focus on current fundamentalism overlooks major facts of history, including colonialism and including the reaction, because actually fundamentalism tends to be reacting to perception of repression and violation, rather than just simply outrage at the world just because it is the world. Now, I think that what I'm having to just hit on these points because of the time limitations. I think that, again, with all due respect to my colleagues here too, I mean, we tend to think of fundamentalism, Christianity, and human rights and so on as if they are part of the same pot. But these are really not representative of humanity. And therefore, we have to be mindful of what about the rest of the world. And again, here, I'm going to step on some toes. I know that I do. The United States invasion and occupation of Iraq, including seizing the country's sovereignty, officially and formally, appointing an American governor general, just like the British used to do in Africa and Asia, is a horrendous source of violation of human rights, the destabilization that happened. But I have not heard any serious criticism of the United States' role in Iraq. But we now hear rather really, I don't think it is undeserved, but just the contrast is what provokes what we call fundamentalists in reacting the way they do. The Ukraine being subjected to Russian invasion and occupation are entitled to protest, and the rest of the world to support them in their protest and to support them in their struggle. But let us do that consistently. The whole point of humanity's Universal Declaration and human rights is that they apply to every human being by virtue of being human, nothing else. And now look and see where that is the case. How about refugees in Europe? How about refugees in the United States? They are really the ultimate sort of victims of human rights violations, because they are denied all protection by their national as well as other situations, and yet they do not, because what we see, by the way, is actually everywhere civil rights, not human rights. Because as soon as the state is the agency that enact and implement or enforce human rights protection, it is no longer a universal claim applying to universal humanity, but it is a system that is necessarily defined by a nation state, however broad it may be, and it is not very broad. I am conscious of the limitations of time. Now, I think again that the contradiction that, because I'm coming from Sudan and having lived in many places and being part of this movement for decades, I am very conscious of the rather simplistic and idealistic notion of human rights as if it is power-free, as if it is a neutral force that is protecting the human as human without reaction to who is who and who is doing what and so on. And of course, this is not the case. Yemen is another example. I mean, there are so many examples. I mean, here we see two fundamentalist Islamic regimes, Iran and Saudi Arabia, sort of fighting over Yemen, with Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most sort of extreme violators of human rights consistently and massively, being totally supported by the United States. And then you wonder, where is the international pressure that is supposed to influence government's behavior and so on? I think to this audience, and I hope to those who are not with us in this room or in this virtual room, we'll see that there is so much to say, but I have to stop here so that others can continue, and then we'll get back to this in the discussion or question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Naim. Our fourth speaker, and again, let me invite you as we come closer to the discussion section to put any questions, comments you'd like to introduce into the chat room. To move on, our fourth and final speaker is Professor Stephen Cattell. He is an associate professor in politics and international studies at the University of Warwick. He is the founder and co-executive editor of British Politics. His research and teaching interests focus on the politics of religion, atheism, and secularism. Welcome, Professor Cattell.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself in very ungainly fashion. Yeah, so thanks to everyone for coming along. Well, it's the afternoon where you are. I think where I am, it's 11 o'clock in the evening almost, so it's nighttime. But thanks for coming, whatever time zone you're in. One of the joys of going last here is that you get to see the previous speakers say things that you were planning to say in your talk. So I'm having to kind of quickly edit this as I go. I'm not going to single anybody out, but thanks, Janet. So I'm going to try and I'll work bits out as I go. So anyway, I'm going to make two key points. I think the first is that we're talking about the concept of fundamentalism, right? And I want to advance the argument that the concept of fundamentalism isn't really that useful. It lacks a sense of the kind of intellectual coherence that we would really want from an analytical concept. Now, that being said, sometimes when you come to do these talks, right, or you take part in these debates, you have a very fixed idea about something, right? And I guess when we come to talk about secularism, I do have fairly fixed views on that. On the issue of fundamentalism, though, I'm more kind of open to being persuaded on this point, actually. I'm kind of sympathetic to bits of how we would define fundamentalism. I think I would put myself as kind of 80-20 on the, you know, it's not really that good, but there are parts of it that I do like. So let me just say that. That's point one. I'm going to advance the view that fundamentalism isn't really that useful as a concept. And secondly, I'm going to also advance the idea that when people use the term fundamentalism, they very often use it, this is the kind of discourse part, right? They very often use it as a pejorative label. It's not used very often as a sort of intellectual academic construct for understanding the world, but it's often used as a way of attacking and delegitimizing your opponents, right? So that's basically what I'm going to run through. So the term fundamentalism then is usually understood to refer to a particular type or a particular form of religion, and it's one of those folk terms, right, where people, you know, if you were to sort of drag somebody in off the street and ask them what fundamentalism was, they would kind of have an idea about what they meant, right? It's like fine art or something, you know. Well, I couldn't really define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And everybody kind of has a view that they sort of know what fundamentalism is. And usually, you know, if you get people to write down a list of characteristics, let's say, about fundamentalism, you end up with things like conservative values, right? Or traditional, authentic religion, maybe, or dogmatic, intolerant, irrational, extremist, prejudicial, violent, right? Or even if it's on a more general level, I mean, I've seen fundamentalism defined like this sometimes as well. It's just people who take religion really seriously, like they have a level of intensity to their belief. It's a sort of unwavering commitment to a set of irreducible beliefs, right? So that's the kind of the folk view of fundamentalism. Now, when you get to the more academic, scholarly interpretations of fundamentalism, they tend to add a few other key features into the mix. Now, one important point to mention here, by the way, is, and this is also one of the reasons why maybe the concept of fundamentalism is a bit wobbly for me, is that there's no consensus on what fundamentalism actually is. And if you read different people, you'll get different views about what the concept means and how we're going to define it. If you sort of boil it down to a sort of few, I mean, I had to take a few things out here for sort of time purposes, but the core features from the academic view of fundamentalism, in addition to the stuff I previously mentioned, for example, you get a view of fundamentalism having an absolutist view of the world. So fundamentalists will very often see the world in black and white terms. They have a very sharp distinction between their group and outsiders. So there's a process of othering that goes on in fundamentalist groups. Fundamentalist groups also will typically believe in some kind of divine plan or cosmic plan that's at work. Usually this plan gives their group some kind of special status. So they'll see themselves as being, you know, the sort of chosen people in some respect. And they very often combine this with a millennialist view. So they take the view that history will come to some kind of miraculous end at some point. And usually, you know, the culmination of this cosmic plan is, you know, they get saved and everybody else goes to somewhere horrible, presumably. Fundamentalists are also usually reactionary and tend to be presented as backward looking. Usually they want to try and shape the political world, and they want to do this by re-invoking or recreating a sense of some kind of mythical utopia, right? It's very often looking back to some kind of resurrecting the idea of some kind of mythical golden age that is said to have existed in the past. And finally here, one thing that often comes up in the academic literature on fundamentalism as well is that it has a literalist view of Holy Scriptures. So this is the idea that Holy Scriptures are inerrant and complete, and they are the Word of God, and they must be followed because they are literally true. And a really good example of this, by the way, I'm going to assume that at least some people here will have heard of this guy, but there's a guy called Ken Ham who runs the Creation Museum in Kentucky. This is where they have like a life-sized version of Noah's Ark. And he takes a very, very literalist view of the Bible in the sense that, for example, Adam and Eve literally existed. There's not a metaphor for anything. It was literally true. And so one question that comes up in debates when Ken Ham is involved in these talks is, well, what do you do about the dinosaurs, right? Were Adam and Eve alive? The dinosaurs were there too. Why didn't the dinosaurs eat them? And so Ken Ham's response to this, and this is the kind of, when fundamentalists take this literalist view of scriptures, they have to kind of go through these, convoluted processes of trying to rationalize everything. The answer to that question is, and I'm not making this up, this is actually what he says, is the dinosaurs were vegetarian. And that's why they didn't eat Adam and Eve. And the dinosaurs were vegetarian until the fall, right? And that was the point at which the world becomes corrupted by sin and they became carnivores. So literalism is also one of the key features of fundamentalism. Now, all of this kind of sounds okay, right, as a description of what fundamentalism is. And I do think there is something about fundamentalism or this general sort of kind of package of ideas that's worth keeping. And this particular point would be the idea of religiosity. So, or the intensity of belief, let's say. So when people measure religiosity, which is a sort of broad measure of how religious somebody is, they tend to look at certain variables, and these variables include things like, is a person a member of a religious organization? How frequently do they attend a place of worship? What kinds of things do they believe in, and how intensely do they believe in these things? And this is really useful, actually, because when you look at attitudes towards social affairs, there is a strong correlation between levels of religiosity and particular viewpoints. So, for example, people who have higher levels of religiosity will tend to have more conservative views on LGBT issues. They'll tend to have more conservative views on things like abortion and assisted dying. They'll tend to have stronger views on the role of religious figures in political life and these kinds of things. So that there seems to be something there that I do like and I do have some kind of sympathy for. However, I think all of the other features of fundamentalism, and I know kind of Janet had a kind of fourfold definition of fundamentalism, which I thought was quite interesting, and I'm probably going to skirt around this because I'm aware the clock's kind of running, but I hopefully we can come back to this in the discussion. It's a bit like, the kind of the Star Wars films in the Disney era, right? It looks good from a distance, but when you get close to it, it kind of just falls apart and it becomes really messy. So, for example, not all fundamentalists are violent. Okay, so some are, obviously, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, for example, but others, like, Jainists, are not. Not all fundamentalists want to influence politics. Some clearly do, like the Christian right in the United States, but others, for example, the Amish, don't. They want to be left alone to, do their own thing. Not all fundamentalists are literalists, for the obvious reason that not all religions will have scriptures that can be interpreted in a literal way. I mean, this is usually linked to the Abrahamic religions. And so if you're going to take that as one of your key features of fundamentalism, I mean, that excludes religions like Hinduism, for example, which, I mean, okay, it has holy scriptures, but it's not normally taken in the same kind of way as the Bible or the Quran, for example, or Buddhism with the Pali Canon, right? So not all fundamentalists are literalists. Critics of fundamentalism as a concept will also sometimes argue that the concept is too broad. So if we want to say that fundamentalism defines a certain set of features, and that's what gives it its analytical value. Well, you then end up with this idea that, you know, you have ultra-Orthodox Jews, you have evangelical Christians, you have members of Al-Qaeda, you know, you have Hindu nationalists all in the same category. And that then starts to look like the category is too broad for it to be clear what it is you're trying to talk about and trying to describe. And not all people who have conservative and traditional viewpoints would, and who you might think would be fundamentalists, would describe themselves as fundamentalists. I mean, this is another key problem with this, I think, because a few years ago, I was doing some research on the idea that there might be some kind of Christian right in the UK, right? Sort of, you know, with similarities to the Christian right in the United States. And I went and interviewed senior figures in organizations that are typically seen to be part of, you know, fundamentalist groups. And when I got to the question, which was, you're very often described as a fundamentalist, what do you think about that? They all of them universally hit the roof and said, I'm not a fundamentalist. This is some kind of slander upon me. They all said, you know, I'm a bog standard, conventional, normal Christian. I believe in, you know, the idea of sin and the resurrection and eternal. These are just normal Christian things. I'm not a fundamentalist. And that was really interesting, because they then went on to make the point that when people use the term fundamentalist, they're not actually trying to, or very often try not to describe something intellectual. They're trying to use, you know, it's an insult, right? It's a pejorative term. It's a way of saying, if I call somebody, you know, a fundamentalist, I don't have to take their argument seriously, because they're some kind of, you know, deranged, crazy, intolerant person, and nobody needs to listen to them. So on a discursive level, the idea of fundamentalism then often becomes an ad hominem way of delegitimizing your opponents, rather than an intellectual, coherent framework of analysis. And I think this also applies very often to the idea of secular fundamentalism. Now, there are things, and you know, I was listening to the presentations where I think we would all agree on issues, let's say like China, for example, and the treatment of the Uyghur. We might even all agree in certain cases of France, right, with headscarf bans, and particularly things like burkini bans, right? So there are kind of common, you know, elements between us, even though some of us might disagree on some other issues. But I think one of the things when we get into looking at the idea of secular fundamentalism is that it also has this kind of pejorative element to it. And so we very often find that people who use the term secular fundamentalism, and I know kind of Janet did this too in her presentation, the argument then becomes that secularists, or radical or militant secularists, for instance, are very often anti-religious, right? They're trying to drive religion out of public life, and there is some kind of attempt to marginalize and restrict religious beliefs. And I've 3 points on this. I'm not sure how long I've been speaking for, so I'll be very quick on them, and then I'll shut up, and you know, we can get on to questions and discussion and so on. The first thing here is that, you know, secularism per se is not anti-religious, and a lot of people who would be described as secular fundamentalists would not be anti-religious. You know, some of the most religious countries on earth, India, for example, the United States, are secular, right? And paradoxically, maybe in those cases, they're secular precisely because they are so religious. You know, secularism was introduced in the United States and India as a way of dealing with potential sectarian conflicts between religious groups, right? The second point is that secularism itself has certain key features. So normally it's things like, you know, equality before the law, separation of church and state, which is really a way of dealing with religious privileges in public life, and a commitment to upholding freedom of religion and belief. But beyond that, and this is where, you know, we might also kind of agree on certain issues, secularism becomes interpreted through various political, social, and cultural lenses. And so you can't talk of a particular secularism. There are secularisms, right? And secularism in France is very different to secularism in the United States, is very different to secularism in Turkey, is very different to secularism in India, And so when people talk about secular fundamentalism, they're not talking about secularism in India, right? Which is usually seen as a very inclusive form of secularism. They're usually talking about specific aspects of secularism in places like France and Turkey, right? And the final point I want to just sort of sign off on really is that when people talk about secular fundamentalism, they also sometimes have, I was going to use the word agenda here, but that's sort of very politically loaded. And I want to kind of, not go down that particular direction, but you very often find it used in cases where the idea is that the groups involved want to promote the idea of more faith in public life. And they see this, for rightly or wrongly, as being a good thing. And so the term secular fundamentalism then is not used as a neutral description of a set of characteristics applied to secularism. It's often itself used as a politically loaded term, as a way of delegitimizing certain elements that are linked to secularism. And so hopefully I didn't go over my time. I'm going to shut up now because I'm aware I have been talking for what seems like quite a long time. So I'm going to finish. And yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to say. Hopefully we can pick up some of these things in the conversation. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Professor Cattell. Your time was good. So let me first turn to the other panelists and back to those to the beginning. Let me invite any of the other panelists to respond to other things they've heard. You can indicate by a finger. Go ahead, Professor Falk, please begin. Please unmute yourself, sir.
First, let me thank the other panelists for very diverse and stimulating presentations. I want to make 2 points, really. One is really a continuation of what the last speaker, Professor Cattell, was saying, and that is, I don't find it very useful to try to conceptualize these terms abstractly. It seems that what is at issue is so dependent on context, historical, civilizational, and political context, and situational, that one really has to talk, as he suggested, about particular cases of the collision of religion and other forms of normative thinking. I would put it maybe better than talking about human rights and secularism, the human rights discourse. Because I think the human rights discourse is also something, as Abdel very usefully deconstructed it, that as something that arose out of a Western hegemonic relationship to the rest of the world. And it tried to sell the rest of the world on the idea that what these norms that were embodied in these seminal documents were universal. And it, in a way, disguised the geopolitical underpinnings. And the geopolitical underpinnings are a part of the normative architecture of international relations. The UN is not an organization devoted to the implementation of an international law treaty, the UN Charter. It also gives the 5 most powerful countries in 1945 the right to exempt themselves. And those include the colonial powers. They have the right of veto, unrestricted right of veto, which means they have a legal right to not obey, not to comply with the discourse of human rights. And so you have a very confused normative architecture in international society, and have had since the beginning of the state system. Before the UN and League of Nations, it was talked of the great powers and the rest of the world. And the great powers did what they wanted and pursued geopolitical ambitions without limitation. The rest of the world was subject to a certain kind of hegemonic discipline. And unless we understand that power dimension of human rights, we don't understand at least the discourse as it's applied today, for instance, as a geopolitical tool by the United States against Russia now and against China, without taking into account its alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia and, in a different sense, Israel. So I think we have to face those contradictions if we want to talk seriously.
Can I offer the unmute to Professor F. Buckingham, who I think spoke next?
We have dueling unmutes here. All right. I was very taken by Abdullah Naim's comment that about the legal system being, following after and dealing with violations, and that what we need to be focusing on to actually be protecting human rights is working to prevent violations. And I really think that there is, once the horse is out of the barn, running around after it and yelling at it doesn't actually, resolve the problem. And so I just kind of, and I finished my talk talking about how we need to be proactive and, particularly in the area where countries are protecting their secularity as against religious minorities. That's the moment to step in and try to affect change. And I find it encouraging to think about where I think we would agree that the international human rights system doesn't seem to be working to be ensuring or bringing about protection for human rights. We need to find some other mechanisms that, dialogue and education and talking to one another, and working towards a globalized system where minorities are being protected, and that there are systems in place that are effective for trying to prevent even global conflict. We have raised the Russia-Ukraine issue. We could raise other issues of global conflict and say the Security Council is an abject failure. And I think the human rights system, we're not going to be giving 5 stars to anytime soon. So let's look towards reforming the global system of the UN in a way that it is more dialogical and more preventative, rather than looking at things after the fact and pointing fingers.
Great. Professor Naim.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I'll just use the couple of minutes I have to elaborate on a specific point. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council are not only exempting themselves, but they are controlling everybody else. Membership of the United Nations can only happen on a recommendation of the Security Council, which any of the 5 permanent members can block. Therefore, there is no way that any state can be part of the international community without the approval of the 5 permanent members. That the problem is that the UN Charter itself is, the 5 permanent members entrenched their privilege, because you cannot amend the UN Charter without, again, the consent of the 5 permanent members. And that any of the 5 permanent members can block any proposal for amendment of the UN Charter, totally and legally block it. The case of the United States and Nicaragua is a horrendous example of the impotence and really the hypocrisy of the international, so-called international law system. Whereas what the United States tried to do before the ICJ would never be attempted by any American court against its own courts, American government against its own courts. To object and to refuse, and then when you are overruled, you withdraw from the case. And then when the case goes against you, you refuse to comply. This is primitive. This is savage. This is not a civilized system which will permit a country like the United States to do that. So I think there is so much that can be said that ultimately, as I said, maybe not this time, but that really the only way to correct is through national governments being driven by their own national societies and constituencies to stand for the legality of international relations and international law. Because nobody can, and in any case, it's a violation of the right to self-determination for other nations to impose. But it's a totally acceptable and respected way of saying that if your own constituent, look at this issue of the abortion controversy in this country. What we see now is really very fundamental, very confusing contradictions. That yes, the Supreme Court should be autonomous and neutral, but we can't allow it to rule, to overrule Roe versus Wade. The other side saying that yes, the Supreme Court is neutral, but we cannot permit appointment of justices of the Supreme Court who are going to upset the balance of liberal and conservative justices. What the Republicans did with the Obama administration regarding as an empty 8 months or 9 months before the elections, and still blocked totally even consideration of a candidate. So it shows how tremendously politicized, and that you get because you have a legalistic system that is not restrained by its own population. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naim. I want to give Professor Cattell a chance to complete our sort of round robin cycle here. But I guess I want to push back just a little bit here on this, if I may, very quickly, in that, Professor Naim earlier brought up an interesting comparison, and I think the work here has, certainly taken critically apart this idea of how important this idea of fundamentalism, how it needs to be historically specific. Your reference, Professor Naim, to Mukharrajin, to another language, to the fact that when we translate this into other languages, we get a very different reverberation of the word, outsiders, people on the edge, things like this, very, very different. But is that fundamentalism really a word that is not very useful? And I thought Professor Buckingham might defend the definition a bit. And I just want to offer one other idea that brings Professor Cattell alluded to also, and that the idea of epistemology, I think, might be fundamental here. And if I may use that, that ways of knowing the world, and that if we remove the extremism idea from this, the pejorative that you spoke to, Professor Cattell, and we think about, is there any room to resuscitate this as a useful concept, as a way of understanding how we can better communicate with each other in political discourse, that this is an epistemological difference, that one of being, as we talk about sacred texts being the key way of knowing the world, and revelation from those texts, as opposed to other manners of knowing the world, particularly sort of empirical, I don't want to say secular, we might say scientific epistemology. And that this is perhaps a different kind of binary, and that we're faced with, and that maybe if we are looking at that as a non-pejorative, we might say, although certainly the brotherhood, the Akhwan certainly took up science to its own cause and technology and things like that. But can we resuscitate this idea and being something other than just a pejorative and speaking about epistemology?
Do we react briefly? Of course, the problem is that we speak the English language, and everything else is shaped and colored by this fact, which is a colonial, of course, project. The fact that English language is the first in the world, the language of commerce, the language of even aviation and traffic control and all that, shows that really everything is an approximation. So when we say fundamentalism and take it to mean what it has come to mean in the American early 20th century context and Christianity, when we apply it to any other tradition, we're doing so by approximation. That is, what looks like what we are talking about here seems to be happening there. Therefore, the term for it is fundamentalism. But if we use actually the Islamists in the Muslim world, and especially in the Middle East, Arabic-speaking region, they called it usuliyah. That is going to the roots, going to the foundation. Asl means the source. So they don't accept it as negative, but they hijacked the term to say that what it means is that it means fundamentals. So we are true to the fundamentals of the faith. And by using the term usuliyah, they get, then we can't apply the term fundamentalism to them in really honest discourse. The problem is, I think briefly, is that we tend to take the language we use as shorthand for something else, something broader, something more complex. And that shorthand is always misrepresenting and or rather confusing use of language. Thank you.
Professor Cattell, do you want to jump in there before we turn to other questions?
Yeah, I think I do kind of still like, because the term fundamentalism is not going anywhere, right? I mean, it's not like we're going to say, well, let's abandon it and use something else. I mean, it's just people have been using the term now for decades, and you know, we're stuck with it for good or ill. And so it might just be that it ends up being one of those concepts that is a bit vague and a bit fuzzy, and you know, hangs together kind of like a rickety old table or something, and you know, we just have to put up with it. I mean, there are other, I mean, the idea of religion itself is a bit like this too, because, you know, I mean, let's not do this, but if you get into a discussion about how you even define religion, you know, it kind of starts to fall apart in a similar way. But everybody uses the term religion, and they kind of have an idea about what it means, and it's still useful, I think, to use that, even being aware of the limitations of it. One of the points I was going to make, although I probably won't make it actually, I'll just sort of flag it up, and then, you know, we can go to questions and stuff and see what happens there. But this was just in terms of trying to pick up on the points that were being made about the international human rights framework. And one of the aspects here in Europe is the European Convention on Human Rights, which draws a distinction between the right to religious belief, you know, your right to freedom of religion and belief, which is an absolute right, and which nobody can touch and you know, disparage or take away or do anything to, and the right to manifest religion in public life, which is a relative freedom. And so when court decisions are made about, there are lots of different cases, involving these kinds of issues, like religious symbols, for example, and the use of religion in employment contexts, for instance. When these kinds of discussions come to the fore, the courts then typically have to weigh up the right to manifest a religion versus the rights of other individuals, right? So it becomes this kind of relative discussion. And one of the things I think, one of the reasons why I think this is really interesting is because, let me bring this back to the kind of broader, more abstract point, which has been raised in respect of secularism and religion, which is the idea of religion being manifest in public life, and or secularists on the other hand trying to kind of restrict that. And I think very often that conversation takes place in very abstract terms. And I think, to go back to the point that sort of Richard made at the beginning with his kind of his presentation, when he was talking about the need for context and all of this, I'm always very interested in what this actually means in practice when we talk about manifesting religion in public life, rather than as an abstract intellectual thing. What are the practical examples that we're talking about? What does it mean to manifest religion in public life in specific contexts? And maybe let's try and deal with those, rather than try to apply some kind of blanket universal, rule, that the one size fits all idea that will work for everything, when it plainly doesn't. So that would be my take on that particular issue, I think.
Thank you. Any response from the panel? Any conversation from the panel? Fine. So let me move to the questions in the chat, and a series of questions from Jay, the initial Jay, that ask us to look at really the nuts and bolts of human rights law, and asks for particular cases or a particular part of let me rephrase it a little bit and ask, is there a way of looking at human rights law that can decolonize it, or can make it so that it avoids some of the problems that have been brought up here?
No. And I just absolutely fundamental no, flat no. Because in 1945-48, when the system was being imagined, it was put in the framework of international law. And international law is structurally incapable of being enforced in the same way that any other law can be enforced. Because there is, we say it all, I have been hearing this from when I was a student in the 1960s, that there is no international government, there is no international sovereign authority that will enact the law and enforce the law. That it always has to be a question of states negotiating. And the paradox of investing, or rather sort of the protection of human rights in the hands of states, which are the primary violators of human rights. The nature of international law, that any action that is harmful or destructive and so on may be a crime, but it cannot be a human rights violation unless it is done by a state or an agent of the state. So that what we see in terms of private actors, so-called warlords and genocide sort of perpetrators, who are acting outside the framework of the law completely, are committing crimes, horrendous crimes, international crimes, probably in terms of crimes against humanity and genocide, but they are not human rights violations. Because you cannot attribute, attribute the actions of private actors to governments. You need to have that link for it to be relevant to legal protection. So I think that unless we can extract the international law paradigm and the human rights paradigm from international law and make it something independent of that, it cannot escape the limitations of international law itself. The international law that would not condemn Russia for invading the Ukraine, or condemn the United States for invading Iraq.
Thank you. Professor Falk, did you want to jump in?
I would agree basically, but I would say rather than a straight no, I would say to some extent. I mean, I think it's possible for governments to be more or less in touch with the values that animate the human rights discourse, such as intolerance, the dignity of the person, and so on, and try to implement them within their national framework. I do think, and I think we agree, that human rights as viable aspects of a political culture overwhelmingly reflect the realities of the state system. And that means they are internally applied or not. And that's a sort of dominant reality. And when outsiders try to enforce human rights, they usually have an agenda that is not associated with human rights. And that's why I think Professor Anaim's skepticism is so justified. How can you explain the contradictions between caring for human rights of the Uyghurs or the Ukrainians, but being indifferent to the human rights of the Palestinians or Saudis? How can you explain that? You can't explain that within the human rights discourse. You have to say something takes precedence. And what I've been saying takes precedence is geopolitics, the discretionary use of power by the dominant states. And we have to understand that, I feel.
Professor at Buckingham, do you have any, you want to make a jump in here, or?
I'm hovering between despair and optimism, you know, I have to come back to the preamble of the Universal Declaration, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And, you know, while certainly there's a lot wrong in the UN system, there are some things that are right, that are good, that I think we can draw on. And the question is how to try to keep the good and affirm those things while trying to reform the things that aren't working. You know, it's the best we have to move forward, and you destroy institutions because of either their history or their current dysfunction at your peril, because it was a lot of work to create the UN, and I totally agree that it was created in you know, with some deep flaws. It continues with some deep flaws, but it's the best we have.
Thank you. And Professor Cattell, do you have any comment on this question?
I don't think I have anything to add to what, I mean, just to agree really with what's been said. I mean, I'm very pessimistic about the prospects of the United Nations reforming, but I don't know where we go from this. I mean, you know, the whole system seems to be stuck.
Mm-hmm. Professor Andreopoulos.
I'm very tempted to join in the gloom and doom, but I would like to inject a bit of optimism here and ask my colleagues to react to this. Yes, I hear Abdu and I hear Richard and Janet and Steve when they discuss, for example, about how the human rights project has been anchored in a geopolitical logic, and this has really influenced its direction and manifestation. And in fact, I would also say that even in the 90s, which is considered by many the golden era of human rights, with all the discussion about human rights become formally one of the pillars of the United Nations system, and about the humanitarian intervention and how we are seriously for the first time thinking about protecting beleaguered minorities and persecuted in other parts of the world by using force. There is also a very cynical view of looking at all this and saying that is also the decade in which the human rights became an apologist, a formal apologist for state power and state violence, what is considered the golden period of human rights. It was basically a period when they were formally co-opted in the foreign policy of states, and they were used to protect and advance state interests and so on and so forth. Having said that, my question is, there is also an understanding and a realization that these documents do contain certain important values, and they have been used by communities in distress as sources of inspiration and mobilization. So if we are disappointed with the human rights, what is our alternative as far as an emancipatory discourse for a more humane and inclusive social order? And here I wanted to ask the participants to react to at least some of the work that has been done by legal anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, in which they try to think in terms of how can we use these norms but render them relevant in local contexts. That is the idea of vernacularization of international norms and how they can be picked up by movements, grassroots movements, in order to render their struggle more meaningful and more relatable and better understood in the global context, but not only as a one-way process, take the global and try to make it relevant, but how the experiences of using some of these norms in the local context can shape our understanding of the global conversation of where we should be going with these norms. So is this a promising venue for an emancipatory discourse? And I would like to hear what my colleagues think about that. Or do we just say we have reached the end of human rights? And there are some scholars that have argued that, and we should be looking for other emancipatory discourses, including those that are based on religious traditions. So I would welcome thoughts and reactions to that.
May I?
Yes.
Actually, humanity has done quite well for thousands of years, before and without the so-called international human rights discourse. Emancipatory discourses have been going on, and people have been relative, of course, to the context and the time and so on. But it is not as if this sort of emancipatory discourse was invented by the UN's human rights system, and it will go to demise if that system is not upheld. But also the point for me is that sometimes believing sort of a lukewarm belief that we are not that bad, maybe things will improve, is in fact retarding the possibility of transformation that we need radically. And again, the history of regions and sort of Europe with the Reformation and sort of enlightenment and so on, it comes out of a struggle that is local and that is very contextual, and that is ultimately always internal to a tradition, to a context, a discourse. When you do that with the human rights discourse, when you say that we localize it and so on, you have to deal with religion. In fact, religion is the primary language of emancipation and freedom and so on in many societies. Often I hear that as if Christianity is the only religion and Europe and North America are the world. But really, just a quick view of what is the world, who is the world, and what are the discourses that can be locally transformative in terms of liberation and so on. I can't escape that religion is a very powerful tool. Actually, I have an article some 20 years ago about what I call the interdependence of religion and human rights, that the two need each other, that religion needs human rights to uphold the human dignity of its adherents, to protect the freedom of believer religion and so on, but also human rights need a religion to legitimize its relevance and value to local communities, which are religious. If you present the people with a choice, your religion or human rights, I assure you, religion will prevail over human rights every time. But if you find a way of reconciling the two, of creating a common discourse between the two, then there is possibilities of mutual reinforcement.
But Abdu, if I may just quickly interject here, you put it at the beginning a bit stronger than you're concluding. You say they need each other.
Yes, they do.
They need each other. It's not just it will be nice if we can get them to interact with each other, but they need each other in order to create more credible, emancipatory language. Is that a correct understanding of what you are trying to say?
No, I think they need each other.
Yeah. But
the need is different. I think human rights really needs religion more than religion needs human rights. I think if we, I'm a Muslim, I'm a so-called practicing Muslim. I have been a human rights advocate since the 1960s, and I have been through all the phases of universality, relativity, talking about overlapping consensus and all of that. If now or at any point I'm given a choice between Islam and human rights, I will choose Islam every time. I can contest how Islam is understood, but I will never accept that a human rights paradigm can replace an Islamic paradigm for me.
Let me pose that same question, the Professor Andreopoulos' question about the relationship between a larger human rights discourse and local vernacularization of that discourse and that interaction. To the other panelists, anybody would like to jump in on that?
I think it really needs to be a both and. What is the United Nations but the gathering of the governments, really, or representatives of the governments of the world? And so, it's at a really high level. But you need to have things at the local level, and that's where dialogue's really going to occur. That's where peace building is going to occur. And that's of course also where conflicts develop if there isn't any peace building. So I would argue that it's both and they in a peace building world, you need both going on at the same time and both informing each other.
And Professor Falk, you look like you're about to speak.
Yes, maybe I can add a word or two. I agree with what Janet just said, but I think what struck me about George's comments was the disregard in our conversation up to that point of human rights as a normative framework for civil society activism, where I think it's performed in many contexts extremely important role. For example, in the anti-apartheid movement, that exerted pressure on South Africa sufficient to contribute at least to the collapse of a racist regime. And that was, I think, one of the important examples where external pressures have had a productive outcome, so that civil society needs, even in something, I participated in the anti-Vietnam War context, and even in that sense, it was important to have a human rights framing of what constitutes law, what constitutes dignity, what constitutes the aims of a legitimate political project. In all those contexts, it helps to have this more or less, even though flawed, authoritative discourse. Now, whether it's an emancipatory discourse or not has to do with the circumstances within which it functions and the degree to which ideological and geopolitical forces are capable of manipulating it for their own ends. So I don't accept the idea that there's an intrinsically emancipatory discourse. There's a human rights discourse has an emancipatory potential. And as Abdul was saying, religion in various ways has a emancipatory potential. And for the peoples of the world, it is a much more relevant emancipatory potential than for the governments. You know, it is something that is real in people's lives in a way that the human rights discourse has never managed to be, except in certain tactical situations. But I think it has the potential to be, and I think it is worth emphasizing and promoting. Where I disagree with what Janet has been saying is, I don't think it's constructive to avoid the critique of what is wrong with the way in which the UN is functioning. True, it's what we have, but in order to make it better, we have to know what's wrong with it. And what's wrong with it is this design which included geopolitical primacy. And as Abdul reminded us, that geopolitical primacy was aligned with colonialism and therefore was ethically flawed from the inception. And this was the idea of the United, to combine these two traditions, because they had looked at the prior League of Nations and decided it failed because it excluded geopolitics. So the UN was supposed to succeed because it incorporated geopolitics and did so by way of this right of veto, which is a nullification of law and morality as objective criteria to guide behavior. A Mexican delegate at the UN, at the founding of the UN, was asked, "What kind of organization have you guys created?" And his response was, "We've created an organization that holds the mice accountable but lets the tigers roam free." Now, unless we come to terms with what that means, I don't think we can make, and coming to terms with it is a rather profound process. And unless we do that, unless we're willing to do that, we're just, we fall into the trap of the worst kind of liberal idealism, in my view.
I need to come to my defense because I never once said that we should overlook the problems of the UN. I said we shouldn't get rid of the UN entirely unless somebody has some better idea, but I certainly think it needs reform. And I'm hopeful that this is a moment that we can get rid of the veto powers on the Security Council. That would be one big win. But we should critique it. We should look to reform it. I'm just not sure I'm ready to get rid of it unless we have an alternate.
Well, I don't think any of us has said get rid of it. But for instance, if you get rid of the veto and the UN becomes a tool for bludgeoning the adversaries of the US in the world, like China and Russia, and the examples you mentioned of the Uyghurs and the Ukrainians are perfect examples of using the UN as a geopolitical tool. And therefore, I maybe unfairly responded to what you were saying, because when it became concrete, I felt you fell into what I regard as the liberal idealist trap.
Just a quick reminder that you need to overcome the veto in order to abolish the veto. Yeah. What I said about the entrenchment is that the 5 permanent members, and they must have had very good lawyers working for them, they entrenched the supremacy of the 5 neo-colonial powers by making any amendment of the UN Charter, which will include overcoming the veto, is dependent on the 5 agreeing to that. And there is no way that the 5 will agree to work with the United Nations without the veto power.
Even one of them can veto the idea of doing away with the veto power. Mm-hmm. And even if one of the 5 does, that's the end.
Yeah, exactly. That's entrenchment, what I mean by entrenchment.
So let me let Professor Cattell get in a word here about back to the question that Professor Andreopoulos asked about the power or value of human rights discourse in mobilizing local activists. And I think that, I'm reading the questions. We haven't had many questions, but I think some of the students or students of this field would be very interested to hear about some of the cases that you have either done your own work on or edited recently, or such about cases where this is relevant.
Yes, so let me try and link several themes together, because I was quite interested in this question here about the non-religious majority and how they're being protected from the radical minority. I'm not sure what country that questioner is from. I'm kind of assuming it's from the United States, but the non-religious are not in the majority in the United States. So there's this category called the nuns, right? The N-O-N-E-S, not nuns in habits, which is used to refer to the religiously unaffiliated, or the non-religious. It's not a particularly great category analytically. It's another one of these, right? Because it includes people who are atheist, and people who are spiritual but not religious, and people who are, Christian or whatever, but just don't belong to a religious organization. So it's a whole kind of hodgepodge. That's at historic highs now, but it's still only about, the latest figures I've seen from Pew, about 26%, 27%, something like that. It's nowhere near being the majority. But to try and go back to the question about how human rights discourses can be used as ways of mobilization, I think one of the really good examples of this is the nuns in the United States, and more specifically, this sort of subset of the nuns, which is the atheist movement in the United States. Because one of the things that they've done discursively is, and they've been quite open about this. This was sort of, in the wake of when the God Delusion was published by Richard Dawkins. We were talking kind of 2006. That was when the whole idea really began to take off in the United States, certainly, of having an organized atheist movement turning itself into self-consciously a social movement, right? And a lot of the conversations that were taking place within atheist forums and online discussions and so on about how they would do this were very specifically about how do we borrow lessons from previous social movements like the civil rights movement, for example, or, the feminist movement. And then one of the things that they kind of settled upon was this language of minority rights. And so you very often find now in the atheist discourse is a framing of atheism and the non-religious, the atheist movement as being a beleaguered minority, in the sense of, this is a civil rights issue because atheists are being discriminated against in a whole bunch of areas like housing and health provision and so on. And so this then became a way of mobilizing people and bringing people together self-consciously in terms of constructing a social movement. And one of the paradoxical but really interesting parts of this is that this mirrored the evangelical aspects of the United States, but who had also used the language of minority rights in terms of, we see some of this in the discourse around fundamentalist secularism, trying to drive religion out and religion is being marginalized and so on. I mean, religion is still by far and away the majority occupation in the United States, but the evangelicals very successfully present this as being, they're a minority, they're being set upon, they're being, beleaguered, everyone's out to get them and so on. And then the atheist movement quite deliberately copied this and incorporated it for themselves. So I think it's a really good example and a really interesting example of the way in which this language of human rights, particularly minority rights, is used to kind of mobilize groups of people politically. There's another, at the risk of kind of veering off a bit, and maybe I won't go into this too much, but there is a kind of connected issue here with the way in which, atheism is discursively constructed as a movement, and the broader way in which the religious and the secular spheres are themselves constructed. Because, we speak of, and people here have spoken about religion being a sort of framework for, understanding people's lives and for mobilizing people and so on. But the very idea of religion itself and the boundary between the religious and the secular, which is kind of, one of the things we've been talking around, is a product of political, social, cultural struggles and conflicts, and is itself ultimately socially constructed. And so there are questions when we talk about religion of, well, who even gets to define what religion is? Who gets to say, because there's a question about what counts as a legitimate religion and what counts as, if you're not legitimate, then you're a cult, right? Or you have to be kind of marginalized, you're deviant in some way. There's a scholar called Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, who some of you may have heard of, who's spoken about this in the context of American foreign politics, because one of the things that she's discussed and analysed is the way in which US foreign policy constructs this idea of religion in terms of good and bad religion. And so good religion is to be the recipient of American funding and American legitimacy, and American foreign policy will kind of help those groups out. Whereas the bad religion, the delegitimate religion, is obviously to be kind of to be scorned and shunned and so on. And so we find these distinctions made in the kind of wider context of religious and secularism all the time. And it's interesting because you can look at, so some religions, obviously Christianity, Islam and so on, will be conventional, mainstream, normal religions. But then you get to groups which are kind of on the edge, like Scientology. Now, is Scientology a proper, legitimate religion? I mean, some people will say it is, some people will say, no, it's not. The interesting question for me as a political scientist is who gets to decide that? And because the process by which that gets decided represents a whole series of underlying power structures in society, which go, and again, let me just hop across to maybe a slightly separate issue, the case of religion and secularism in France, which we've also kind of talked about. One of the interesting parts of this is that the secular and the religious spheres are co-deterministic. They kind of need each other, right? They thrive off each other. And one of the really interesting things about secularism in the case of France is the way it constructs religion as its other in order to legitimize itself. And we can see this, bringing this down to a very practical example in the case of the headscarf ban and the burqa ban and the burkini bans and so on, because this is framed as a religious symbol. And maybe it is in some cases, but generally speaking, you know, a lot of Muslims will say it's actually the burqa is not a religious symbol at all. It's a cultural symbol, you know, and not all Muslims will agree that this has anything to do with religion. But the French state, in terms of defining what it means to be secular, will say, no, this is a religious symbol. So the French state is going out of its way to say, this is what religion is, this is what religion means, this is how religion functions. And in the process of doing that, we'll define what we are as a secular state. And so all of these things are connected in the sense that they're all discursively, socially constructed, and they all go back ultimately to the underlying power structures of a given society. Now, that was quite a wide-ranging, you know, piece of, I don't know, whatever that was, piece of analysis or so on, but hopefully that connected various, you know, several of these kind of points together.
Well, discursively constructed and dependent on power is always a good place to end. We are set to adjourn at 7 p.m. and we are 1 minute away. So let me thank our panelists very much, Professor Cattell and Professor Falk and Professor Naim, Professor F. Buckingham, and let me thank Professor Andreopoulos for putting this panel together, and thank Alex Johnson, who also was a key organizer of this, and thank you to everyone who attended here and sent in your questions. And we hope you'll attend future events at the organized by the Center for Human Rights here at John Jay. So thank you very much. I think George has a final comment.
Yes, thank you, Avi. And I would also like, on behalf of the center, to express my thanks to our participants, Janet, Richard, Abdu, and Stephen, and to Avi, also for his stewardship of the session, and to all of you for being with us today, and to indicate that, of course, the conversation on this issue will continue, and I hope we'll have other opportunities to do so. I want to thank also all those who have been participating in our activities throughout the academic year. This is the last formal event of the center for this academic year, but please stay tuned for what will hopefully be an exciting program for next academic year. And thanks also to our team at the center for all their terrific work that they have done throughout the year in organizing and making possible these activities. And we'll see you next year. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.